I am not encouraging or advising anyone to modify their firearms. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only.
What's up, everyone? Episode 1, Slide to Frame Fit. Here we go. First off, I want to thank everyone who watched the previous episode, which was the introduction to this project. Some of you shared great tips, tricks, and information in the comment section. A special shout out to Camp Firearms, Camp J95, and Strangest Productions. They answered a bunch of questions for me and provided a bunch of great information. Strangest Productions even made a video with some tool recommendations and tips for this project. He showed a sick 4.6-inch 2011 build that looks similar to what I'm trying to do. I'll link to that video in the description. The general excitement and encouragement surrounding this project and video series was really great to see, so thank you all very much for being here and participating in this. I want to direct you to some information and resources in the description. There will be a list of page numbers from the 2 Kuhnhausen manuals that deal with slide to frame fit. I will link to my previous video on 1911 slide to frame fit. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend watching about the first 8 minutes. There's a link to a Hayes Custom Guns video. The first 7 minutes show the slide to frame fitting process. I really like Hayes Custom Guns videos. They are a great source of information. I revisit them frequently. If you like my content, you'll probably like that channel, so go ahead and check it out. There's one more link to a good video that basically shows the same procedure as the Hayes video, but with some variation in technique that I found valuable to see. With that out of the way, let's get into it.
As shown in the 2 videos I mentioned, and page 122 of the Colt 45 Kuhnhausen manual and page 97 of the M1911 Kuhnhausen manual, it seems the best way to achieve an improved slide to frame fit for an accurized 1911 is to fit and lap the slide in from zero clearance components. Starting with a slide and frame that have oversized rails, the location of interferences must be determined. Rail material must be removed until a near zero clearance or line-to-line fit is achieved. Kuhnhausen calls this a little bit tighter than a light drag fit. There will be minimal additional material removal with finer media until the slide and frame get to a light drag fit and then can be lapped in. After this process, the slide will move freely under its own weight, but there will be little or no perceptible play. The total horizontal and vertical clearance in this condition will be less than 1/1000th of an inch. Let's get my rails and slots measured up. Before taking any measurements, I made sure to thoroughly inspect and deburr the slide and frame rails. There really wasn't much to do. Frame rails, easy to measure with calipers. Measure in a few spots all along both rail sections. The frame slots, I put 90/1000ths gauge pins in the slots and measure across those gauge pins, and then I subtract 180/1000ths from that measurement, and that will give me my slot width. I did go ahead and buy myself a special tool. This is a groove micrometer. It has these little discs and it measures grooves inside and outside very accurately. You can get into places where you couldn't get otherwise. I got this used, paid $120 for it on eBay. It measures 0 to 1 inch in 1/1000th of an inch increments. I did take this to my work and check it with gauge blocks, and it is dead nuts on. So I'm really stoked. I got a great deal on this, brand new. These are $400. Measuring the slot height. So 15. Okay, so 50 plus 15 is 65. I'm going to measure more points along both rail sections, and since I'm measuring between here and here, I have to take into account the thickness of these 2 discs. They are 25/1000ths each, so I have to add 50/1000ths to that measurement, which gives me 115. Now I can use these to measure my rail height too. So that is 99.5. 99.5. That one's closer to 100. And since I'm measuring between the 2 discs, I don't have to account for the thickness of the discs in this case. I'm going to measure up the slide in the same way. Groove mic to measure the slot and rail height, and then the inner rail width here I can get with my calipers. And then I will be sticking my gauge pins in this slot and this slot and measuring between them with my calipers in here. But in this case, I will have to add 180 thousandths to my measurement to get the inside slot width. I've made myself a couple of handy little visual data sheets. My vertical interference is coming from here and here. This is 3.5 thousandths wider than this, so there's going to be clearance on this upper rail and slot. So that means to get to my line-to-line fit, I need to take 3 thousandths off of this rail. Looking at my horizontal measurements, I have plenty of clearance between this slot and this rail. My interference shows up at this upper rail and slot. I have 3 to 4 thou of interference, or 1.5 to 2 thou per side. Looking at where to remove material, it's going to be easier to take it off here and here than from in here and in here. Similarly, it's going to be easier to remove material from this face, the bottom face of the slide rails, than trying to open this slot up. On page 100 in the M1911 Kuhnhausen manual, they point out the same areas to be adjusted when fitting a slide in a frame from 0 or near 0 clearances, adjustments at 1 and 2 for the vertical clearances, and at positions 3 for the horizontal clearances. As I'm taking any material off these rails, I want to make sure that they stay square and parallel. If I don't, we might have a weird taper or something like this on one of the rails, and then it's only going to be contacting at this little point, and it will wear off super quickly and your clearances will open back up. What we want is the rails to be square with each other to make sure we maximize bearing surface and minimize wear, and make sure those clearances that we've established stay that way for as long as possible. Let's consider this a top-down view of the rails. And similarly, if this rail surface isn't parallel to this rail surface and these rail surfaces aren't parallel to the slide slot, then you're going to have high spots somewhere that are going to wear off really quickly and your clearances are going to open back up. I started the slide material removal with fine stones and some honing solution. That was going to take way too long. I switched to a fine number 2 cut file. This took material off at a more reasonable rate. It was pretty easy to bridge across the rails and keep my cut even and the rails square. I was taking measurements frequently between passes. When I had maybe a thou or a little less of material left, I switched to 600 grit sandpaper backed by a file to end with a nicer finish. I was using CLP as a lubricant for this. I slowed way down and took even more measurements along the length of the rail as I snuck up on my final dimension of 115 thousandths. This initial material removal wasn't particularly hard, just very time consuming. This took about 2 hours. There's just a lot of surface area across the 2 rails to work with. After I was done with my groove mic, I measured maybe a half a thou of total variation in rail height over the length of the slide, between 115 and 115.5. Not bad, but also not great considering the fit I was after. Luckily, I erred on the side of leaving more material. It probably would have been better to machine about 2 thou off than finish it by hand. I want to clarify, when you hear me talking about half a thou or something, it's approximate. This only measures to the thousandth, but these lines are fine. So you can see that's probably 15.5. That's maybe a couple over 15. That's maybe a couple under 16. As I was inspecting this Atlas slide and taking measurements, I discovered the top is not parallel with the rail surface by about 30 thousandths of an inch from here to about here. I honestly don't know if this is common on 1911 slides. Let me know in the comments if you know. That's not really enough to notice by looking at it, but enough to completely ruin the rails if you made the assumption they are parallel with the slide top and went to machine it. Remember to sweep in your work before machining. I was only taking material off up to here, not along the sides of the spring plug tunnel. This might interfere with my dust cover. You can see a little step here in the rail area down to the dust cover, so maybe it won't. I'm going to leave it for now and we'll deal with it later when I get the slide on. For my first go at this initial slide material removal, it went okay. It just took a while, and erring on the side of leaving a little extra material was a good decision. I will show you how I evened out the waviness of the rails later. I needed to machine myself some soft jaws for this new vise. While I was at it, I made a fixture or a jig for taking material off the frame rails. I got the idea from that Hayes custom video. He had a fixture that was much nicer than what I've done here, but this should work fine. I started with some extruded aluminum angle stock, then machined one leg so it just replaces one vise jaw. Then I found the extrusion wasn't actually square, so I had to machine this surface to ensure perpendicularity with the other leg. I have a straight edge and a piece of sandpaper clamped in here. It's only sticking up high enough to contact the frame rails. Now I can add some oil and take material off the frame rails while keeping them even and parallel with each other and square with the world. I worked on one side at a time, so it was easier to keep track of measurements and how much I took off. I started at 760, took about 1.5 thou off the first side, then 1.5 thou off the other. A half thou is about all the accuracy I can get with my calipers. That might even be stretching it. When I was done, my rails were measuring at 757 across, maybe a little over. Remember, my slide slot was at 756 to 757 along its length. Again, I wanted to err on the side of more material. This method and fixture worked really well. There isn't much surface area on the frame rails, so it went pretty fast. I don't think this took me more than 20 minutes, even while being very careful and measuring a lot. I don't think it would be feasible to do this without some sort of fixture. I know I couldn't take this material off with a file or stone and keep the rails square and even with each other. At this point, the project got very challenging and frustrating. The work you've seen so far, I got done in like an afternoon. The work you're about to see to get the slide all the way onto the frame to the point where I could lap it in took 5 days, about 3 to 4 hours each evening. I went really slow and I still almost ruined this slide and frame. The two biggest challenges for me were identifying where material needed to be removed and how much material needed to be removed based on the resistance I felt between the slide and frame. That second bit can only be learned by doing it. There's no other way to gain that experience or get a feel for it. What I want to focus on in this section are my biggest challenges and mistakes. I think that will be the most valuable. Sorry in advance to those of you who have done this process successfully. You will probably be screaming at your monitor. It's messy. The whole point of the following work is removing a tiny bit of extra material until the slide goes all the way onto the frame, a bit more than a light drag fit, so I can start lapping it in to the final clearances. This is where I was at after the initial material removal. The slide would go on about 1/8 of an inch. It wasn't even contacting the full frame rail width yet due to the lead-in chamfer, so that meant that my slide rails were still too thick. I erred on the side of leaving more material, and if you remember, the slide rails were a little wavy from my initial material removal. Here's how I cleaned that up. The other thing I can do with this platform, now that I know it's flat, is put some sandpaper on it and do this with my slide rails. And now doing this, I have to hang, the spring plug off the end. So if I do strokes like this, whatever section I pull off coming this way is only going to get half as many strokes as something over here. But I also know there's a little bit of waviness in these rails from my initial material removal. This might help me start evening that out here where I couldn't get the same number of strokes on whatever this little section is. I can take care of that by hand with some fine sandpaper wrapped around a file. After I was done with that, I could get the slide on all the way over the first rail section. It's hard to figure out which rail surface to take material off of. Resistance is resistance. You can't tell which interface it's coming from, or certainly I couldn't. Marks on the slide are easier to see because the rubbing only shows up on half the surface due to that little step up to the frame rail slot. This creates contrast and makes the marks more obvious. I couldn't see rub marks on the frame rails at all. A Sharpie is your friend. I degreased the frame rails, marked them up, re-oiled them. I saw where it was rubbing on the frame rails after that. Another thing I realized as I was pushing the slide onto the frame is that the rails will spread out a little bit. So like as you push it on, they'll spread out a little bit. And It'll go on more as they open up, but it'll get to a point that it stops. I was taking measurements frequently. However, the amount of material I was removing at a time was not measurable with the tools I had, yet it was still making a difference in the fit. I kept taking material off the slide and frame rails very slowly and checking it. The slide would inch on little by little. I would get frustrated, stop for the day, come back to it the next. Eventually, I got the slide almost all the way onto the rear slide rail. This is where it got shitty. I was leaning on this thing way too much to try to push the slide on. I saw the Hayes Custom guy doing a similar thing in his video, pushing the slide on against his bench. Well, now I know he probably wasn't leaning on it as hard as I was because he knows what the fuck he's doing and I don't. It's funny, and by funny I mean stupid, because I thought I was being so diligent and so careful, and it was taking me so long. You would think I wouldn't be forcing it that hard. I think I just got impatient. I pushed it most of the way onto the rear frame rail. When I went to take it off, it didn't budge. I had to smack it with a hammer. Luckily, it came off, but I already knew what happened. Well, I fucked up. I did not clean the slide and frame rails good enough before I pushed that last one on, and you can see something was in there, and it gouged both of my rails. They're not that deep, but that fucking sucks. Now I got a little goober on the inside of the rail that I got to clean up. I smoothed out the inside of the slide slot with some 600 grit around a thin file. I also smoothed out the individual rail sections that were damaged. The gouges weren't very deep, so they cleaned up pretty nicely. You could still see them, but they were faint. I thoroughly inspected, deburred, chamfered some corners, and smoothed some edges on the slide and the frame rails. It was clearly still too tight, so I took some more material off the frame rails. I cleaned the hell out of the rails and oiled them up before putting the slide back on. I made sure they were spotless. I tried putting the slide on again. I didn't force it on nearly as hard this time, and guess what happened? All right, so this is fucking ridiculous. I just picked up another little burr somehow. I just cleaned the shit out of that, made sure it was spotless, oiled the hell out of it. It went on smooth, and then right as it started coming off, it picked something else up and dragged it through. I could feel it. You see it got there too. I think I figured out what's doing it. Like a really sharp knife edge right here where the cutout for the safety breaks through to the slot. I broke the edges and smoothed out the whole area where the safety cut intersects the slide slot with some 600 grit sandpaper. I once again cleaned up the galling damage, inspected my frame rails, broke edges, chamfered, smoothed, and polished. After that, it didn't happen again. I got super lucky that the slide didn't seize on the frame. That would have been game over. I don't know for sure what caused the galling either time. How hard I was forcing the slide on sure could have. Maybe I just didn't clean it well enough the first time. I know I did the second time. When the slide gets past the first rail, maybe it can move side to side just enough and dig into the frame as it's starting on the rear rail section. Maybe I was leaving sharp edges on the rails after material removal that were digging in and scraping up a burr. Maybe the thumb safety cut here had too sharp of an edge on the inside and a chunk got knocked off. Maybe the damage from the first galling makes it more likely to happen again. I did check for embedded chunks by scraping the damaged areas with a dental pick. Oh, one more stupid mistake I made. I dropped the slide and it hit a metal stool leg on the way down. Did this. I'm planning on chamfering the front of the slide later, so that will probably get rid of this, but yeah, dumb as shit, man. I finally got the slide on to the tight side of a light drag fit. I started lapping it in with the slurry created by the 1000 grit sandpaper and oil I was using for the last little bit of material removal. One argument I've heard against using lapping compound is that the media can get embedded in the rails. Fair enough. I could see how that might happen. I'm not too concerned about that. When I started working the slide back and forth, it loosened up pretty quick, maybe 10 cycles. That's the second argument I've heard against lapping compound. It can loosen up the fit too quick and make it sloppy. I definitely think this is more of a concern. I washed the rails down with solvent. I used alcohol and scrubbed them with a brush to ensure all the lapping compound was removed. This was recommended on page 122 of the Colt 45 Kuhnhausen manual. After that, I worked the slide with only oil to achieve the fit I wanted. I would err on the side of a slightly tighter fit at this point. I'll be working the slide back and forth more as I fit the barrel and eventually test fire the pistol. Keep in mind the slide and frame rails are relatively soft when they don't have a surface treatment like nitride or a coating like DLC. I did have some slight contacting on my dust cover in this high area here along the spring plug, so what I've done is just put some tape around the side of the spring plug tunnel, and to keep my file off it, I'm using a file with a dead edge, and then I will have some 600 grit underneath it, and I'm just going to gently work this area down until it's flush with the rest of the rail surface. I went back over all the rails and slots one last time to make sure I had adequate chamfers and smoothed and blended any sharp edges or corners. On page 110 of the M1911 Kuhnhausen manual, it calls out a 10 thou by 45 degree chamfer on all 4 of the outside frame rail edges. I cleaned with alcohol and a brush one more time, then reapplied clean oil. I am surprised how well this turned out despite my lack of experience in the issues I had. This fit is exactly what I was hoping for, but I didn't think I would realistically achieve it. This is smooth as oiled up glass, and there is no play between the slide and the frame whatsoever. You can see some minor scratches and damage from where the burrs got in, but I still have plenty of bearing surface and the rails appear to be square, even, and parallel. In these episodes that cover a more involved task, or certainly ones that I have less experience with, I plan on summarizing the process at the end and letting you know what I would do different next time. Sprinkled throughout will be discussion of the biggest challenges, my biggest mistakes, and my most valuable learnings. First step is measuring up the slide and frame rails. A groove mic really helped with this, but the rail measurements were so uniform across the length of the slide and frame I don't think it's necessary. You can measure the slide rail and slot height back here, and if you bought high quality parts, it's likely a safe assumption that they are uniform enough for this type of fit along their length. The frame rails and slots are easy enough to measure in multiple places along their length as well. I found that forward of this point, the slide slots open up. You can see a little change in the finish right there. That's where it steps down a couple thou. That makes sense because this is really the area we are concerned with when the slide's in battery. Accuracy is about the slide and the barrel coming back forward to the same place each time. Maintaining a tight tolerance for more length than you need will increase the cost of the part due to more machining time. Identifying where interference occurs is easy once accurate measurements are taken. It seems like it's most common for the upper frame rails to be wide and the lower slide rail to be too thick, and that's where you're probably going to remove material. Bulk material removal happens next. If I were to do this again, I would machine material off the bottom of the slide if I had more than 2,000s to go. Remember, the top of the slide may not be parallel to the rails. Sweep the rails in before machining them. There's a lot of surface area on these rails, and material removal was slow. The more you have to remove by hand, the more likely you'll have waviness and non-uniformity. I would leave no more than 1 thou to do by hand. If you machine the rails, I would also go ahead and machine all the way along this spring plug tunnel. Whenever removing material by hand, use oil with your stone or sandpaper. You saw me using a file without sandpaper to take material off these rails initially. I wouldn't recommend that. If you're using a file, you have too much material to take off and it should be machined. Using a file that takes more material off faster may result in more non-uniformity across the rail length. I'm guessing that's where my waviness came from. Removing material from the frame rails was easy. I wouldn't machine these unless there's like 4 thou or more per side. You absolutely need some sort of fixture to keep these square as you remove material. It doesn't have to be fancy, you saw that I just used a slightly modified piece of aluminum angle stock. There are a couple of companies like Matrix Precision and Everglades Ammo that sell jigs. When the slide is just starting on the frame, it can be hard to identify where more material needs to be removed. A juicy Sharpie or some die chem is your friend. At this point, so little material is coming off, you're not likely to be able to measure it with typical calipers, but it will be affecting the fit each time. This was the most difficult part of the task for me, obviously. It's hard to get a feel for this without doing it. Go slow, don't force the slide on too hard. If you're leaning on it like I was, just don't. Just remove more material. If your slide's only going on a little ways like this, before you put it back on, I would clean off any grittiness left from the sandpaper and oil you were using to remove material. This creates more resistance and could lead you to believe you need to take more material off than you actually do. Just use oil. Keep in mind, the slide will spread out a little bit as you push it on. It may stop, and you might mistake this for some non-uniformity along the bottom of the slide rails. Anytime the slide's going onto the frame, thoroughly clean the rails, inspect them, keep an eye out for your chamfers going away as you remove material. Break and smooth edges as you go. Clean the rails again, inspect them, clean them again, inspect them, clean them again, oil the hell out of them. As I snuck up to the point where the slide would go all the way onto the frame with a little bit more than a light drag fit, I was using 1,000 grit sandpaper instead of 600 grit that I was using earlier. Again, a little more than a light drag fit is hard to get a feel for unless you've done this. You can use the slurry created by the 1,000 grit and oil or other lapping compound to initially open up the clearances, but be careful because it loosens up quick. I would recommend using only oil if you're new to this process. Solvent wash and scrub the rails with a brush, work it back and forth with only oil until the slide just moves under its own weight when tilted. I would err on the side of a tighter fit at this point. When that's done, clean up any material around the spring plug tunnel that may be rubbing on your dust cover. Once again, clean, inspect, deburr, reestablish chamfers, break, smooth, and blend edges and corners, clean and inspect it again, then apply a final coating of oil. Well, I'm really glad that this part of the project is finally done. I'm pleased with how the fit came out, but shit was it difficult and frustrating. I've seen a lot of videos of professionals doing this and they make it look way too easy, and that's just because they've done it hundreds of times and it's easy for them. I'm not knocking those videos. I appreciate the content and there's a lot to be learned from them. I certainly lulled myself into a false sense of security going into this task by watching that type of video. This was a humbling experience and a good reality check as I start this project. I like to think I know my way around a 1911. I certainly think I understand the mechanics of the platform. I understood this process, the measurements where material needs to be removed and by how much. But this is not something I could get a feel for without doing it. I don't know that I have a good feel for it after only doing it once. Certainly, it would go smoother next time. I hope this video is helpful. I hope for those of you who aren't professionals, this may have given you a more accurate picture of what doing this is like if you haven't done it before. I am sure other aspects of this 2011 build will go like this, and I'll do my best to show all the challenges and my mistakes so that you can hopefully learn from them. Once again, I want to say thank you. I really appreciate all the people who have been helping me out, leaving tips, tricks, and information in the comments and answering my questions. Let me know if I missed anything. The next episode will be barrel fitting, another project with aspects I am very unfamiliar with. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.